In the age of Semaphore Entertainment Group, MMA was unformed, shrouded by traditional martial arts, a land of one-night tournaments, dick punches, and everlasting steroids. But then there was weight classes, and with weight classes came disparity, big and small, light and heavy, and of course, jacked and fat. Then from the dojos they came and found the souls of lords within the flame. Coleman, the first of the belt, Fujita and his head of iron, Overeem, the lord of steroids and his very fantastic body, and the furtive Verdun so easily forgotten.
In combat sports, there exists a belt that isn't real. You can't see or hold it, no governing body controls it, and it's never even been officially awarded to anyone. Yet its importance is undeniable, and the person who owns it is arguably the single baddest man on the planet. It's the motherfucker belt. The BMF, or Big Motherfucker belt, was initially awarded to Jorge Masvidal for ploughing more mothers than the satanic cult in Rosemary's Baby. Alongside the Power Slap World Championship belt, the Bad Melon Farmer belt is Dana's big push into the world of make-believe titles, and also the first belt ever conceptualized via 2 AM drunk text. Okay, so we're not actually talking about the UFC's first ever gimmick weight belt, but we are talking about a conceptual belt, an imaginary title that has been passed from man to man like a prestigious STI, a title that no one can vacate or be stripped of, a title you earn until another man takes it from you by force. This is the story of the lineal heavyweight title. But what is the lineal title, and why has it taken 4 minutes of forced Dark Souls analogies to get here?
This is what I do, my friend!
When attempting to explain the concept to my wife, the vacant expression behind her eyes after the first hour was an indicator that for a lot of people, the idea of a lineal champion can be more difficult to grasp than the motivations of the average JRPG antagonist. So before we continue, I'd like to try and break down the concept for any of you who are unfamiliar via the medium of Tekken. It's 1994. Heihachi Mishima announces the first ever King of Iron Fist tournament. His son, Kazuya Mishima, wins the tournament in what could be described as the world's first 10-7 round when he throws his father off a cliff. While it might seem excessive, this is actually an ironic act of revenge, as Heihachi threw Kazuya off a cliff when he was only 7 years old. But a cursory glance at Tekken's lore reveals more people being thrown off cliffs than a Spartan neonatal ward. Regardless, Kazuya is now the inaugural winner of the King of Iron Fist. At the second King of Iron Fist tournament, Heihachi wins the title back from Kazuya by, let me just check my notes real quick, by throwing him off a cliff, this time into a volcano. Heihachi regains the title and is now the new King of Iron Fist champion. The third King of Iron Fist tournament is set 15 years later, and the new emo anti-hero of the series is Jin Kazama, son of Kazuya and grandson of Heihachi. In the final battle, Jin takes on his grandfather because I guess it was cheaper than family therapy, and after being shot point blank in the head, breaks the cycle of cliff-based violence by power slamming his grandfather through a wall and then turning into a bird, and becomes the brand new King of Iron Fist champion. So across 3 championships, we now have a clear line of succession as the belt passes from Kazuya to Heihachi to Jin. Now, in order to make this analogy work, let's say Jin wins the next 5 Tekken championships in a row, but then leaves the Tekken world behind to join the Street Fighter universe because they allow you to have your own corporate sponsors. He has to leave the King of Iron Fist belt behind him, but as he never actually lost the belt in a fight, he is still technically and linearly the King of Iron Fist champion. Over in the Street Fighter universe, he beats everyone on the roster, from Balrog to Bison, but eventually loses to Chun-Li after being distracted by something.
Hard as a rock, let me show you something.
The line of succession for the lineal King of Iron Fist title is now Kazuya to Heihachi to Jin to Chun-Li. The next person to beat her will become the new lineal King of Iron Fist champion, and so on and so forth. The idea of a lineal title was conceived by boxing fans after their sport became swamped with more bodies than the Valverde mortuary. Boxing was, and to an extent still is, overrun with organisations like the WBC, WBO, IBA and NWA, to name but a few. By 1983, there were 3 officially recognised governing bodies in boxing: the WBA, WBC and IBF, and all 3 had crowned their own heavyweight champions. The situation had only gotten worse by the 2000s, as by 2015, the WBA had more champions than a fucking League of Legends tournament, with 43 officially recognised title holders in that organisation alone. In order to try and bring some semblance of sanity to this mess of titles, champions and organisations, Ring magazine had as early as the 1960s begun attempting to define a single lineal champion in each division and awarding them an honorific Ring champion title. This ultimately led to the creation of the lineal champion, and this imaginary title is in some fighters' eyes more prestigious than the actual title. In 2003, Lennox Lewis was quoted as saying, "My linear championship is at stake. That's greater than any of the other championship belts out there. There is no higher title." In heavyweight boxing, the title can be traced directly from the current champion Tyson Fury all the way back to John L. Sullivan in 1892. MMA, on the other hand, is younger than the average girlfriend of Leonardo DiCaprio, with its first ever event being held in the halcyon days of 1993. But in those days, there were no rules, no restrictions on comically oversized crucifixes, and no weight classes. You can't start a heavyweight lineage if there's no heavyweight division. As such, the origin of MMA's lineal heavyweight title begins on February 7th, 1997, at the Dothan Civic Center in Alabama, at UFC 12. That UFC 12 ever took place at all is a miracle in itself. It was February 1997, and mixed martial arts was still looked down upon harder than an orgy at the base of the Eiffel Tower.
We don't let roosters engage in cockfighting. We don't allow dogs to fight pitbulls. We don't allow human beings to go out in the street and engage in this kind of activity. We call it disturbing the peace, but we'll do this in a sanctioned manner in various arenas throughout the country. It's a sad commentary on American society.
With John McCain's war on professional fisting in full swing, the UFC made the ballsy move to book an event in Niagara Falls, New York, a state that had only grudgingly approved no-holds-barred fighting events 5 months earlier, in October of '96. While McCain vs. the UFC is the most famous example of political meddling in MMA, it was an event staged 2 years prior to UFC 12 that didn't even involve the UFC, that caused New York's caginess around no-holds-barred fighting.
It's real, and they're going at it, and it's men beating the crap out of men, and it's good.
In 1995, film producer Donald Zuckerman alongside Penthouse magazine founder Bob Guccione combined their wealth of experience with straight-to-VHS movies and straight-to-the-bathroom magazines to create a no-holds-barred promotion called Battlecade – Extreme Fighting. The inaugural Battlecade was to be held at Brooklyn's Park Slope Armory on November 17, 1995. In an effort to generate hype for a sport that was more underground than the cast of The Descent and just as likely to be buried alive, Zuckerman contacted various news outlets to get the word out that Battlecade Extreme Fighting was here, and that the fighting was extreme. The word didn't just get out, it was fucking set loose. You've heard of the 1980s Satanic Panic? Well, get ready for the 1990s fisting furore.
Are we moving back toward the ancient Roman gladiators?
Perhaps.
In the week leading up to the event, the New York Times ran multiple pieces on Battlecade that seemed to exist only to grab the attention of anyone powerful enough to shut it down. Journalist Dan Barry described no-holds-barred fighting with the kind of hyperbolic outrage hard-on that was the hallmark of 1990s tabloid journalism. The sport resembles video games like Mortal Kombat and Killer Instinct, where the violence is continual and bloody, only it's real. Another New York Times article by Ira Berko, titled Better Than a Stick in the Eye, prompted McCain himself to wade in, writing an open letter to the New York Times to let them know that, while he had never seen or heard of Battlecade, he just really hated that darned extreme fighting and wasn't going to rest until No Holds Barred only existed in shitty Hulk Hogan movies. I have not had the displeasure of viewing extreme fighting, but I've seen segments of its reprehensible predecessor, the Ultimate Fighting Championship. These repugnant events should be banned because they pose unacceptable risks of severe injury to the participants, and for their glorification of cruelty. But Battlecade did themselves no favours either. Zuckerman didn't so much shoot himself in the foot as he blasted himself in the face with a blunderbuss when he answered a press conference question about the rules of Battlecade by saying there was no biting, no eye gouging, and no mercy. And while that sentence is so ludicrously cool that whenever someone reads it aloud the Just Bleed guy pops an involuntary erection, back in 1995 it was essentially taunting the powers that be to shut them down. One of the people in attendance at that press conference was Senator Roy Goodman. Goodman had been alerted to Battlecade's plans to host an event by this asshole.
The problem is it's not a sport, it's an animalistic attempt by one human being with no protection and no gloves and nothing to try to maul and basically destroy another human being in a ring.
Goodman summoned the unholy powers of Rudy the Ghoul Giuliani and Senator George Pataki. The three men formed like the lamest Voltron of all time, and Battlecade's first event was shut down before it ever started. The memory of the Battlecade fiasco was still fresh in the minds of New York politicians when the UFC came to town for UFC 12 Judgment Day in February of '97. Terminator 2 Judgment Day was a turning point for the UFC. After 11 events that had the same regard for decorum as a 4chan politics thread, the UFC took their first step towards applying some kind of sanity to this pugilistic pandemonium. UFC 12 was the first event to implement weight classes, a step that was actually cited by James Ladner, aka the Just Bleed guy, as the moment he started to fall out of love with MMA. Granted, there were still only two divisions, lightweight and heavyweight, but I guess that was a concession too far for the man with the most famous flex in MMA. Heavyweight was anything over 200 pounds, and rather hilariously, lightweight was anything under 200 pounds, which by today's standards means the current middleweight champion Dricus du Plessis could pack on 14 pounds of McGregor-esque head muscle and still make 1997's version of lightweight.
How do you like them apples?
UFC 12 featured a one-night tournament in both weight classes. The winner of the lightweight tournament would be crowned the inaugural UFC lightweight champion, but rather oddly, the winner of the heavyweight tournament got nothing. Instead, the accolade of inaugural heavyweight champion went to the winner of the night's main event, a showdown between Dan Severn and Mark Coleman. Alongside these concessions to the rules, and New York's blossoming romance with no-holds-barred fighting, the UFC had hired a lobbyist named James D. James D. Featherston to spread the word about our Lord and Saviour Dan Severn to anyone with political clout. Featherston's lobbying was working too. Politicians who were formerly anti-MMA were being won over, slowly but surely. It seemed a sure thing that UFC 12 would be the very first MMA event to be held in New York, but enviously lurking in the shadows like MMA's very own Gollum was Battlecade founder Don Zuckerman. When word of UFC 12 spread, Zuckerman was all like, "I started this gangsta shit, and that's the motherfucking thanks I get?" Not to be outdone, he sent word to Times journalist and professional MMA hater Dan Barry that Battlecade was coming back, and this time it was going to battle all the Cades. New York politicians were on the horns of a dilemma, as allowing Battlecade to come back after they had unceremoniously booted its ass back to Wilmington, North Carolina, would be a complete embarrassment. Governor George Pataki and Senator Roy Goodman went scorched earth in an attempt to enact a complete ban on MMA, and while that failed, they did manage to exert enough pressure on the State Athletic Commission to transform MMA into American gladiators with mustaches. The SAC enforced more rules than a pedantic dungeon master, and with only one day to go before UFC 12, they issued 11 pages of rules designed to give the Just Bleed guy a terminal case of ED. Kicks above the shoulder and below the knees were banned. All fighters had to wear headgear, and the octagon size was increased from 32 to 40 feet. Which at least means it was now big enough to accommodate Mark Coleman's traps. Nevertheless, these rule changes made it impossible to hold a no-holds-barred event in the state of New York and still keep men like this entertained.
It's real, and they're going at it, and it's men beating the crap out of men, and it's good.
What had seemed like a surefire win for the UFC had been ripped from their hands at the last second, as is so often the case in life. They were left no option but to tear down the octagon, pack everything up, and pray to any gods that were still awake in that forgotten hour that the Dothan Civic Centre wasn't double booked with a quinceañera or something that weekend. The UFC chartered a jet and flew everyone, fighters, trainers, journalists, and the octagon itself, from New York to Alabama. The plane was so overloaded with luminaries of no-holds-barred fighting that Carlson Gracie was quoted as saying, "If this plane goes down, no-holds-barred would be extinct." But the plane did not go down, and with Janie's quinceañera just wrapping up, dark forces gathered over the Dothan Civic Centre, for Judgment Day had arrived. After working round the clock to salvage the event, cameras finally rolled on UFC 12 at 8 p.m, and commentator Bruce Beck breathlessly introduces us to Dothan, Alabama.
It was recently voted the #1 place to live in Alabama, and at one time was considered the peanut capital of the world.
Frustratingly, Beck blueballs us by not disclosing which city usurped Dothan in the peanut stakes. UFC 12 was notable for several things. This was the event where the UFC released Joe Rogan into early access before his hair was nerfed in a patch and his HGH gut was buffed. There were ludicrous scenes during Waleed Ismail vs Takahashi. Takahashi might be low-key the dirtiest fighter of the no-holds-barred era. Within seconds of the bell ringing, Takahashi attempted the first recorded submission via wedgie. The wedgie was so severe, Ishmael's cup was dislodged and dangled pendulously between his legs like comically large testicles. Takahashi received a whopping 34 warnings for grabbing the cage, with 0 actual repercussions.
Like the experience. No, we can read him, but he's got both legs for him now. He's hanging up Ismail here. We'll have it up on the ground. And that.
All of this is before even mentioning that he's clearly sporting a case of staph that's already eaten so much of his shoulder that the Dothan Civic Centre was at risk of being ground zero for a global staph outbreak. UFC 12 was also the debut of 19-year-old Vitor Belfort. Despite being too young to legally drink, it hadn't stopped him guzzling human growth hormone like a Batman villain before the second phase of a boss fight. As a result, Vitor looked more jacked than Mark Coleman, who himself looked like he was smuggling extra lats into the octagon. Both Rogan and the commentary team constantly called Vitor Victor Belfort.
Trey Teligman, Victor Belfort. Here's a look at Victor Belfort.
I'm here live with Victor. Congratulations, Victor. Unbelievable victory.
With UFC 12 being a one-night tournament, Victor had 2 fights against a bizarre assortment of fighters. His first opponent was Trey Teligman, who, owing to a childhood injury, only had half a chest, and with a name like Trey, only half a name. Teligman was missing an entire pectoral muscle, but unfortunately for him, Victor had found it and grafted it to his own body. Belfort steamrolled Teligman, and the mythical fighter, no known weakness as Victor, was born. Victor's next opponent was Scott the Pitbull Ferozo. Ferozo was archetypal of heavyweights of the no-holds-barred era, in that he was a pit fighter, his physique was big fat party animal, and his tale of the tape was the most comically extreme biography since Motley Crue's. According to his tale of the tape, Ferozo was more extreme than a 1990s video game mascot, announcing him as an anything-goes, power-striking headhunter who was ring deadly, street lethal. Ferozo weighed in at 323 pounds for UFC 12, and in his first match of the night, this corned beef leviathan completely crushed a hopelessly undersized kickboxer named Jim Mullen. Ferozo had beaten Tank Abbott at UFC 11, and Tank was a guest commentator when Ferozo faced off against Victor. As the fight got underway, the commentary team praised Victor's hand speed, to which Tank dismissively retorted,
"It don't matter, Roy Jones Jr. ain't gonna knock out Mike Tyson."
Approximately 2 nanoseconds after those words left Tank's mouth, Victor knocked out Ferozo, and Tank got real fucking quiet. The rivalry between Ferozo and Tank endured for years after UFC 12, despite the fact that they never officially rematched. I say officially because in 2011, Tank and Ferozo didn't so much come out of retirement as they came out of a retirement home and agreed to a backyard brawl to settle things once and for all. I can't actually show any of the footage without getting this video age restricted, but the fight is essentially Tank dry humping Ferozo for 15 minutes. And while at first look it might seem pathetic that 2 UFC veterans, long past their prime, are reduced to brawling at someone's cookout in a sub-world star video, I still think there is a bizarre merit to this fight. They had a grudge dating back to 1996, and their desire to prove who was the best endured even though both were well over a decade past their prime. No commission in the world would sanction this fight, except for maybe Golden Boy. Tank was pushing 50, and Ferozo was now a car salesman who had part of his foot amputated only a month before the fight, but they still had that fire. Old age couldn't rob them of the desire to shut the other guy up, and when no one else would sanction them to fight, they sanctioned themselves. This wasn't for a belt, or money, or prestige. In a bizarre way, this backyard scrap was like an art house movie, or an album by someone like Bell Witch, something that exists solely for the sake of its creators, and has no interest in lucrative mass market appeal. It was about as far from the glamour of modern day UFC as possible, and that turns what could just be a sad backyard spectacle into something oddly fucking beautiful. It was real, and they going at it. Men beating the crap out of men, and it's good. Or maybe it was just 2 big old fat guys humping in a backyard. The main event would decide the first ever UFC heavyweight champion, Dan the Beast Severn, or Mark the Hammer Coleman. It can be easy for modern audiences to forget names like the Beast and the Hammer. Their last fights took place before some fans were even born, and they existed in a pre-internet time when MMA was practically invisible to the public at large, celebrated only by the handful of lunatics dedicated enough to fill minuscule locations like the Dothan Civic Centre. But Coleman and Severn deserve to be remembered. At the time of their match at UFC 12, they were considered the two best wrestlers in MMA. Their dominating, pseudo-sexual grappling style, combined with Coleman's pioneering of ground and pound, meant that they were the fighters to emulate, and love it or hate it, paved the way for the first era of wrestling domination in the UFC. UFC 12 was Coleman's third appearance in the promotion. He had previously fought at UFC 10, the tournament, where he had beaten Gary Goodridge and also become the first man to defeat Don Frye, and thus became the lineal owner of Don's mustache. Coleman had also won the 8-man tournament at UFC 11, the Proving Ground, but that was slightly less impressive considering he faced competition such as advanced level ASAX practitioner Julian Sanchez. What is ASAX? If UFC 11 is an indicator, ASAX is the ancient art of lying about having 23 bare-knuckle fights and tapping out after 45 seconds when a roided-out Olympic wrestler who has never skipped neck day bludgeons you into a fine paste. To compound the lackluster nature of UFC 11, Coleman was declared the overall winner by default, after Scott Ferozzo pulled out of the final due to an injury, which at least saved Coleman from a severe, ring-deadly, street-lethal beatdown. Dan Severn was one of the first men to truly challenge the limits of the Gracies and the limits of what can be considered acting.
It'll be time to release the beast.
Severn had gone 16 minutes with Royce Gracie at UFC 4, the longest match Royce had endured until that point. The entire fight was 16 minutes of Severn grinding Royce into the canvas until he pulled a Chael Sonnen and lost via triangle choke at the last second. Severn had also won the UFC 5 tournament and the Ultimate 95, where he beat Tank Abbott, Paul Varelans and Oleg Taktarov all in one night. Before the UFC ushered in their heavyweight championship title, Severn had won the beta version, the Super Fight Championship, after defeating Ken Shamrock at UFC 9, although thanks to last-minute Athletic Commission rule changes that banned closed-fisted strikes to the head, aka punches, that fight is largely considered to be less enjoyable than a Colby Covington evening at the Improv set. By the time of their fight for the heavyweight title, Severn was considerably older than Coleman, at 38 years of age, and on the 16th fight of his career, he was practically decrepit by MMA standards. Conversely, Coleman was 32, and absolutely riddled with nothing but the finest of under-the-counter South American protein powders.
There is a big difference between Mark and myself.
Yeah.
And even when I fought him, were we fighting on the same level? No. I pride myself, the fact is that I'm lifetime chemical free.
Yeah.
You look at Mark and you look at that body and stuff like that.
That's
there's things what you could do by drinking all the right protein shakes and stuff like that and doing all the right calisthenics and things of that nature. That's why there's called a natural bodybuilding competition, and then there's the pro bodybuilding where it's like going, use it all, baby, use all these testosterone boosters and steroids and the whole 9 yards.
There's not enough protein shakes under the sun to get a physique like Mark Coleman's.
Yeah.
If Severn was nervous about any of this, he certainly didn't show it, as when Big John McCarthy asked him if he had any questions before the fight, Severn asked him a fucking math question.
I wonder, John, if I had a bicycle, I could travel 10 miles an hour, that train travels at 50 miles an hour, and I got to travel a 30-minute distance. How many apples does Mary have left in the basket?
The fight itself only lasted a little over 2 minutes, after a scramble led to Coleman submitting Severn via scarf hold, and with that, Mark the Hammer Coleman became the first in the lineage of UFC heavyweight champions.
You've shown a domination that we haven't seen in this sport since the very beginning. You right now are the best reality combat athlete on the planet Earth.
Dan Severn only fought once more for the UFC, After the loss at UFC 12, he jumped around so many other organizations that there's a pretty good chance he fought for Def Jam Fight for New York, Cage Combat, Rings, WEC, King of the Cage, Metro City, even our beloved Pride. They all starred Dan Severn. It wouldn't be until the year 2000 that Dan returned home to the UFC at the questionably titled UFC 27 Ultimate Bad Boys. But by then, Dan was already 42 with a lifetime of wrestling miles on him. In the main event, it only took one kick to the knee from Pedro Hizo to end Severn's career. For one whole month, as he continued to fight on for 12 more years. To really put the legend of Dan the Beast Severn into perspective, this man has had 127 MMA fights. Suplex Mario has had more fights than the entire current top 5 of the UFC heavyweight division combined. His MMA career started in 1994, the same year the PlayStation 1 came out, and his last fight was in 2012, shortly before The Last of Us came out for the PS3. Severn has more miles on him than a fucking moon rover. In 1984, Dan had lost in his attempt to make the Olympic wrestling team, owing to a controversial loss to Lou Bannock. After a lifetime of training for that moment, this failure would have likely seemed as if it were the end of everything. Loss of any kind can seem so overwhelming and so final that it blankets our vision to all else. But loss also plants seeds for a new beginning. And Severn's failure at the '84 Olympic trials were the springboard for something far greater. A 127-fight career that helped legitimize the fledgling sport of MMA and created an iconic fighter. At the time of his last fight in 2012, Dan was 54 years old, facing a 30-year-old named Alex Rosman, a man who looked like he had been vigorously consuming the leftovers in Coleman's supplement cabinet. Dan had lost his last 2 fights by knockout, so this fight was his chance to either go out on the high of one final victory or the hurt of riding a 3-fight losing streak into retirement. For 15 minutes, this 54-year-old man hump and thumped a man 15 years his junior and cruised to a unanimous decision win. In a sport where fighters like 39-year-old Tony Ferguson are considered to be fighting well past their prime, the fact that Dan Severn could not only compete at 54, but compete and win against a far younger and far more chemically enhanced opponent is nothing short of inspirational. After the win over Rosman, Dan finally called it a career, with a grand total of 101 wins, 19 losses, 7 draws, and 1 magnificent mustache.
It'll be time to release the beast.
Five months after UFC 12, Coleman was set to make his first title defense at UFC 14. His opponent was a kickboxer making his UFC debut, named Maurice Smith. UFC 14 took place on July 27, 1997, as Chumbawamba were poised to ruin everyone's summer with a song more infectious than the bubonic plague but only half as pleasant. Maurice Smith was poised to ruin the 4-year-long uninterrupted hump parade that wrestlers in the UFC had hitherto enjoyed. UFC 14 Showdown was another tournament card, this time featuring the newly minted middleweight category. Middleweight was actually just the lightweight category, rebranded to have a slightly less ridiculous name, like the MMA version of when John Cougar Mellencamp became John Mellencamp. Middleweight encompassed everyone under 200 pounds, and heavyweight was still a fucking carousel of steroid-engorged ogres. Alongside the introduction of weight classes at UFC 12, UFC 14 was another step towards taming the no-holds-barred era, as it was the first event where 4 or 6 ounce gloves were mandatory. Up until then, the use of gloves was like that of toilet paper, completely optional but highly recommended. Yet the only man to use them pre-UFC 14 was Melton Bowen, a boxer whose gloves couldn't save him from an Ishida Kim-inspired beating by actual real ninja Steve Jenham at UFC 4. That July evening in 1997 was a good night for debuting fighters like Kevin Jackson. Jackson was a wrestler who had won gold in the 1992 Barcelona Olympics. He had also wrestled at the infamous Team Foxcatcher, at least until the paranoid delusions of Foxcatcher owner John DuPont compelled him to kick every black athlete off the team in an effort to remove everything black from his home. Jackson had one no-holds-barred fight before his UFC debut, an arm triangle win at Battlecade Extreme Fighting 4, before retiring with a record of 4 wins, 2 losses. Making his debut in the heavyweight tournament was Mark Kerr. I've talked about Kerr previously on this channel, but for anyone unfamiliar, Mark Kerr was a wrestler nicknamed the Smashing Machine. In his prime, Mark Kerr was an absolute specimen, responsible for a global outbreak of feeling like a pencil-necked weakling. While he was famous for his brutality inside the cage, outside of fighting, Kerr was a softly spoken, gentle giant. In the HBO documentary The Smashing Machine, Kerr openly discussed his near-fatal painkiller overdose and his struggles with pre-fight anxiety.
Before I fought Paul Warlands, I remember taking about this much of a sip of water, like in a Dixie cup, and like walking around and going, just heaving this little smidgen of water up that I had just taken in. My stomach, I couldn't hold anything down. At that point, I'm talking to myself and I'm going, you know, I can't believe I'm doing this. I can't believe I'm fucking doing this.
But in 1997, long before his painkiller addiction would hamstring his career, Kerr was still very much the Smashing Machine. Going into UFC 14, Kerr had 3 no-holds-barred fights, all 3 of which had taken place in one night, at the World Vale Tudo Championships only 5 months before. In the 4-man heavyweight tournament of UFC 14, Kerr first brutalized the hapless Moti Horenstein, whose entire MMA career seemed to exist solely as that of a chew toy for wrestlers named Mark. Mark Coleman had obliterated him at UFC 10, and now it was Mark Kerr's turn. Shortly after Horenstein was scraped off the canvas, Kerr faced Dan Bobish in the final. Bobish resembled a UFC heavyweight far more than the woefully undersized Horenstein. At 6'1" and routinely weighing in at over 350 pounds, Bobish looked like the boulder of Sisyphus had rolled down a hill of steroids that led straight into the octagon. Unlike other super heavyweights of the time such as Scott Ferozzo, Bobish's sole fighting attribute wasn't just mass. He was an accomplished wrestler, an NCAA champion, and his boxing was good enough that at one point he had been a sparring partner of Mike Tyson. When he and Kerr clashed in the final, no-holds-barred fighting had never seen so much mass, yet so little cardio. The sheer volume of muscle Kerr and Bobish presented tested the very limits of octagon engineering. Never before had it played host to such juiced-up juggernauts. Never before had the world of no-holds-barred fighting been bestride by such chemically enhanced colossi, while we petty men walk under their huge legs and peep about to find ourselves dishonourable graves. I mean, these were some big fucking dudes. As the bell rang, Bobish admirably, but stupidly, decided to rush Kerr, possibly in the hopes of a quick knockout. Kerr secured a takedown and submitted Bobish with one of the more brutal submissions of that era, by grinding his chin into Bobish's eye. No eye gouging was one of the few rules the UFC had in 1997, and while Kerr's win was deemed legitimate, Mark Kerr is now the reason that chin-to-eye submissions are illegal. With the tournaments completed, it was time for Mark Coleman to defend his heavyweight title against Maurice Smith. Smith was an unknown quantity for a lot of fight fans in 1997. His background was kickboxing, and if all you watched at the time was the UFC, you would probably never have heard his name before, and assumed he was going to wind up like every other boxer, kickboxer or karate man of that era who faced off against a grappler and wound up tapping to full mount or whatever. But Smith wasn't a kickboxer in the same vein as this dude in his Clariday's Karate School t-shirt. Smith was the WKA kickboxing champion, and the WKA paved the way for the popularity of kickboxing in Japan. As its champion, Smith saw his popularity in the land of the rising sun surge, and he was invited to take part in the Universal Wrestling Federation in 1989. While the UWF was a pro wrestling outfit and the outcome of its fights were almost certainly predetermined, it was what's known as a shoot-style organisation, meaning its matches looked and felt as real as possible and gave Smith his first taste of mixed rules bouts. In 1987, Smith also starred in the most radical movie of all time.
This band is the only family I had.
They're all black belts in Taekwondo and they're pretty bad.
I want you to mess it up by going out with a second-rate musician like that John character.
They came in here to play goddamn songs for kids!
Boss, everybody stood!
Okay, so that's not actually the real Maurice Smith, but someone, not me, has clearly gone to a lot of trouble editing the wiki page for Miami Connection to make it seem like Smith the kickboxer was also Smith the actor. And before you complain about me going off on yet another unrelated tangent, try and tell me your day hasn't been made immeasurably better now that you know a movie exists where a cocaine-dealing ninja motorcycle gang is at war with a synth-pop band of Taekwondo black belts. I'm giving you gold here. After his stint in UWF from 1993 to 1995, Smith fought legitimate, non-worked mixed rules bouts in Japanese proto-MMA organisation Pancrase. Pancrase allowed both striking and grappling, but fighters were only allowed to use open-handed strikes rather than punches and were forced to wear shin pads. Smith didn't have an easy time there, with only 2 wins and 4 losses to the likes of Masakatsu Funaki and Bas Rutten, but a loss to the old Ken Slamcock in December of 1994 would change the trajectory of his career drastically. After the loss, Smith was invited to Shamrock's Lion's Den gym in order to prepare Ken for UFC 6. In Smith's own words, he did more talking than training with Ken, and if you've seen Ken's coaching on Season 3 of The Ultimate Fighter, you won't exactly be shocked to hear that.
We didn't train this morning. We watched a UFC that I've probably seen a bazillion times.
I was shocked at the light way that Ken went about training us. You know, I'm used to a different style. I'm used to a lot more rigorous training regimen.
It's just not organized. It's not the kind of camp that I see Tito, Saul, and Dean running. You know, it makes me envious. It really does.
When Ken took all of his VHS tapes of UFC 9 and abruptly left MMA for the world of WWE in February of '97, Smith began training with Ken's brother, Frank Shamrock. At the time, Smith said he felt like he was being pawned off to the lesser Shamrock, while Ken went off to be a WWE superstar. But while Ken may be the more famous of the two, Frank is arguably the more influential, and almost certainly the better mixed martial artist. Frank was one of the first fighters to truly mix the martial arts, and he formed a bond with Smith that endures till this day.
He didn't have stuff, and he fought for it. And that's how we ended up becoming brothers. I mean, he is my brother. If he calls me, tomorrow, I'll be there no matter where it is, because he's always been there for me. And that's, when you're a warrior and you trust no one and someone shows you that type of love and respect and care, that's your brother.
Through Frank, Smith learned a rudimentary ground game involving sprawls and submission defense to complement his world-class striking. Smith put his newly honed skills to the test when he fought Marcus Conan Silveira at Battlecade Extreme Fighting 3 in 1996. For 2 rounds, or phases as they were called in Battlecade, Smith nullified Silveira's grappling and punished him with leg kicks. In the third phase, Smith TKO'd Silveira with a head kick and won the Extreme Fighting Heavyweight Championship. While Smith's win over Silveira isn't exactly exalted in the pantheon of legendary fights, this was a hugely significant moment. In the history of MMA until that point, strikers had been nothing more than bipedal body pillows for grapplers. No striker had beaten a legitimate grappler, and Silveira was about as legitimate as they came, being a Carlson Gracie Jiu-Jitsu black belt. Notoriously grappler-phobic publication Black Belt Magazine had been waiting for a striker that could beat a grappler for so long that they practically threw a fucking parade for Smith. After years of seeing every mystical exploding fist martial art that was the magazine's bedrock get destroyed by grapplers, Smith was exalted by Black Belt, who labelled him a heroic jiu-jitsu killer. A kickboxer beating a BJJ black belt in no-holds-barred fighting was about as rare as Sean Strickland actually finishing a fight.
I don't care about my opponent's life. I hope he dies in there.
Well, unless he dies of old age, that's probably not something you'll have to worry about.
A gun in every hand, and a woman in every kitchen.
No! I'm not doing this again, Shadow! I've had it with this edgelord bullshit!
By March of '97, Extreme Fighting had battled their last Cade. But as the promotion that kickstarted the war for MMA in New York was soccer-kicked into bankruptcy, the UFC scooped up two of its champions, Kevin Jackson and Maurice Smith. Smith was given an immediate title shot against Coleman in what was seen at the time as a title unification bout for the Extreme Fighting and UFC heavyweight titles. When Smith made the walk to the octagon at UFC 14, Mark Coleman was already viewing this fight as a foregone conclusion. He naturally assumed that what he'd do was shoot, take down, scarf hold, and go home and play Call of Duty.
I'm going to reset my internet. Run your mouth a little bit too much.
As such, Coleman's preparation for this fight involved copious amounts of alcohol and a blatant disregard for yet another guy he assumed had graduated with a GED from Clariday's karate school. He could not have been more wrong. Going into the fight, he said his preparation had been going out drinking and watching Maurice Smith on film. But the film Coleman watched was probably fucking Miami Connection, as he picked the wrong Maurice Smith to underestimate. Coleman said, "To me, he looked like a guy that I was going to take down, punch a few times, slide off to my side headlock, and walk out of there." Little did he know that Smith had been training with Frank Shamrock specifically to defend that side headlock. Smith had angered Coleman in the pre-fight interviews when he besmirched Coleman's striking abilities.
He doesn't know how to punch. He punches like a girl, okay?
So seconds after the opening bell, Coleman shot, secured a takedown, and started slamming headbutts like a Glaswegian after closing time. Coleman threw 3 headbutts in a row and then rained down punches. Smith weathered the storm and utilized some basic jiu-jitsu to nullify Coleman's grappling. He grapevined Coleman's leg to prevent him from passing, and when Coleman finally secured the scarf hold, Smith just shrimped out of it. Seeing these kind of grappling fundamentals being utilized by a kickboxer was so astounding in 1997, the commentators sound like they just saw Smith pull off King's rolling death cradle.
Smith is well versed in the guard. I am truly amazed. This athlete knows some good jiu-jitsu here.
Had this fight taken place today, Coleman would likely have won due to the fact that he controlled Smith on the ground for almost 15 straight minutes. But this was 1997, and with no submission or KO after 15 minutes, the fight went to overtime. Going into those final minutes, Coleman was beyond exhaustion. He spent the entire 6 minutes of overtime with his hands on his knees, sucking more wind than an proctophiliac. Don't Google it. Conversely, Smith was still fresh and kept landing leg kicks and jabs, even using his taunt button at one point. As Coleman slumped out of his corner for the final round, he wore the expression of a World War I veteran who's just been asked if he wants mustard on his hot dog. With a minute and a half left in the final round, the lights went out in the arena, plunging Smith and Coleman into near-total darkness and foreshadowing the end of Coleman's all-too-brief title reign. When they sprang back to life, they illuminated a new era, one where Maurice Smith had mixed the martial arts like no one in the UFC had before him, and was the brand new heavyweight champion of the world.
It's real, and they're going at it, and it's men beating the crap out of men, and it's good.
Speaking about the fight, Coleman later said, "After the 2-minute mark, everything just fell into place, and I realized how dumb I was taking on a championship fighter of Maurice Smith's caliber and just absolutely showing him no respect." After the fight, Coleman sank into a depression. He had thought he had the world of mixed martial arts all figured out, that his wrestling and scarf hold were all the tools he needed to beat any man the UFC could put in front of him. Instead, Maurice Smith had exposed him as one-dimensional and shattered his perception of MMA and of his own abilities. It took 2 weeks after the fight before Coleman could walk again, and when he did, he was on a mission to reclaim his belt from Maurice Smith. But despite all the willpower and self-belief in the world, a rematch with Smith would never happen, and that July evening of 1997 would be the last time Coleman ever held the UFC heavyweight title. A rematch had been scheduled for UFC 15, but 2 weeks into his camp, Coleman blew out his knee and was unable to fight. Smith instead fought Tank Abbott, while Mark was sidelined until UFC 17 in May of 1998. His return to the octagon wouldn't be the dominant return to form he had envisioned. Coleman faced Pete Williams, another product of Ken Shamrock's Lions Den gym, who had Maurice Smith in his corner. Williams nullified Coleman's grappling just as Smith had before him, and in the overtime rounds, he ensured a place on the UFC highlight reels in perpetuity when he sent Coleman on the lightless walk with a kick to the face. It was Mark's second straight loss, and his first ever by KO. He wouldn't fight again until January of 1999, this time losing a split decision to Pedro Hizzo. The once dominant Mark the Hammer Coleman, the first ever UFC heavyweight champion, was now riding a 3-fight losing streak in a sport that seemed to have evolved past him almost overnight. By 1999, the UFC was hemorrhaging money. Every event was being personally funded by Bob Meyerowitz, and every event was losing him millions. The cash flow problems were being felt everywhere. Contracts for fighters like Randy Couture weren't being honoured, and the UFC held multiple events in Japan because they were cheaper to produce. Yet despite this, they still couldn't even afford to send their commentators to Japan. Instead, new addition to the commentary team and sadly missed cornerstone of MMA Mike Goldberg had to record his commentary over a taped version of the events.
Joanna Jędrzejczyk.
These cash flow problems also presented an issue for Coleman. The money the UFC were paying in those days would make an Apex card prelim fighter making 12 and 12 feel like Scrooge McDuck, and now it was even less. But word was spreading of an organization in the East. An organization with unlimited funds, as long as you didn't ask where those funds came from. An organization where steroid regulations were treated with the same regard as a serving suggestion on a box of Hot Pockets. I'm Napoleon Bonaparte, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a fighter not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in USADA. It belongs to science. No, says the man in New York. It belongs to the Athletic Commission. No, says the man in the UFC. It belongs to Dana. Coleman rejected those answers. Instead, he chose something different. He chose the impossible. He chose Pride. An organization where the fighter would not fear USADA. Where the steroid scientists would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small. In April of 1999, Coleman joined legendary Japanese organization Pride.
The greatest show in the history of martial arts. I hope you enjoy it. We'll be back in America soon with the championship belt.
I'm Guy Mesger. I'm here at the Pride. It's real, exciting, and it's extreme.
On paper, his losing streak followed him east, as he lost his first fight in the organization to Nobuhiko Takada. However, it's widely accepted fact that this fight was worked harder than Meshuggah's drum kit. Takada was a pro wrestler desperate to look legitimate, and Coleman was a legitimate fighter desperate for cash. When asked about the fight, Coleman said, "It was what it was. I needed to support my family. They guaranteed me another fight after that, and I needed that security. It was what it was. I'm going to leave it at that." After the loss to Takada, Coleman had a greater career resurgence than Jesus Christ. He would go on a 6-fight winning streak, including winning the Pride 2000 Openweight Grand Prix. The Grand Prix win would prove to be the apex of Coleman's career. As post-Grand Prix, he would trade wins and losses up until his retirement in 2010. Mark suffered a litany of health problems post-retirement. In 2013, he needed a hip replaced, something that was only possible after Coleman begged one of his former sponsors to keep him on their insurance. By 2015, his remaining hip needed replacing, and it was discovered that a near-fatal infection had set in. With no income and no more insurance, he had to rely on the kindness of strangers via a GoFundMe to pay for yet more surgery. In 2020, he suffered a heart attack. Despite all this, in 2023, Coleman announced that he was coming out of retirement for a celebrity boxing match.
Big news. I just signed a contract with Celebrity Boxing.
As depressingly inevitable as that news seemed, something even worse than the prospect of a 58-year-old Coleman fighting Jake Paul was in store. In January 2024, Coleman was hospitalized 3 times, citing yet more hip complications. On his most recent trip to the hospital, the man once known as the Hammer began live streaming from inside the ambulance.
Heading back to the hospital again, 3rd time in a month. Dislocated my hip, wasn't doing anything, so... Oh shit. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Sober's cool. Carnivore diet. And ancestral tenets. Hammer house for life.
Seeing a man whose takedowns once seemed like they had the power to crack the sky itself, live streaming his own hospitalization, likely in order to try and make some streaming revenue to offset the bill for the ambulance, is genuinely depressing, even more so when you realize that stories like these are only too common in retired MMA fighters. What's also concerning about this is Coleman shouts out the Liver King. If you're unaware who that is, he's a man who consumes testicles and peddles bullshit. The Liver King story is far too long to even begin to touch on in this video. All we need concern ourselves with is that the Liver King made millions by convincing people that they too could look like a fatally constipated He-Man without the need for steroids. All you needed to do is follow his core beliefs, eat raw bull testicles, and expose your anus to direct sunlight. That last one isn't even a joke, he really did advise that. Obviously, Liver King was full of horse shit. He blends it into smoothies. But he was also a fraud, and was eventually exposed as a steroid-guzzling shit merchant. A man like Mark Coleman was never going to be able to cure his myriad health issues by sunning his asshole and gnawing on raw horse bollocks. Coleman needed surgeries, physio, pain management, and probably DDP yoga based on what it did for Butterbean, which is why it's so depressing to hear Coleman spouting the liver-infused lies of a creatine-chugging charlatan, as if any of the Liver King's teachings could have actually helped him. We've witnessed in real time fighters like Diego Sanchez being conned by Joshua Fabia, and the tragic endings endured by fighters such as Stephan Bonnar. Seeing Coleman racked with pain, yet still taking the time to shout out the Alpha Bro equivalent of healing crystals, almost seems like he's suffering the fates of both Sanchez and Bonner simultaneously. As the man who was the first ever UFC heavyweight champion, he deserves better than this, and I just hope someone can put him in touch with Diamond Dallas Page rather than the Liver King before it's too late. Maurice Smith would have his first title defense at UFC 15 Collision Course. The event took place on October 17, 1997, and was another pivotal moment that steered what had once been a style versus style storm of dick punches in the direction of being a legitimate sport. Yet more rule changes were introduced. Hair pulling, small joint manipulation, and headbutts were now illegal, much to the chagrin of Kerr and Coleman, who utilised headbutts as the best base for MMA. UFC 15 took place not in an arena, civic centre, or even Krang's Technodrome, but in a tent in a casino parking lot, with roughly 2,500 die-hard fans in attendance. Referee Big John McCarthy wrote in his autobiography that this event was the moment where everyone involved, from staff to fighters, began to seriously wonder if a career in No Holds Barred was about as worthless as an arts degree from Clariday's karate school. Despite being beset on all sides by pay-per-view bans and being debased to the point of fighting in tents like a steroid-fueled three-ring circus, UFC 15 forged ahead regardless. The event featured a four-man heavyweight tournament, a heavyweight super fight, and the heavyweight title fight. The heavyweight tournament was dominated by Mark Kerr, who faced whatever the polar opposite of a murderer's row is, maybe a choir boy's chorus. Kerr obliterated two guys who don't even have Wikipedia pages, which is unusual considering his first opponent, Greg Stott, was the Grand Master of his own martial arts style, known as RIP.
RIP stands for Ranger International Performance and is the most expeditious and effective form of hand-to-hand combat in the world. That's why the RIP team's here at UFC 15 to prove why RIP rules and all others rest in peace.
Stott claimed to be 30-0 in Army Bear pit fighting, the world's second best Mad Lib based fighting style, right after Fuckmaster T-Rex Bare Knuckle. Army Bear pit fighting leaves me with more questions than answers. Why is the army training bears? Did Scott fight 30 bears in a pit, Brienne of Tarth style?
This is one shameful fucking performance.
And where the fuck are my weaponized army bears? Stott's first big mistake was wearing tan-coloured booty cutters into the octagon, which made him look like an overgrown naked toddler. And his second big mistake was using a fighting style whose barrier for entry is a belief in magic against a man who routinely turned opponents into a regretful mass of screaming injuries. 17 seconds into the fight, Kerr threw his first and only strike. A Scud missile knee to the face that banished Stott to the darkest depths of Erebus.
This is one shameful fucking performance.
But better than the fight itself was the fact that the fighter introductions birthed a legend. As Bruce Buffer introduced us to Kerr's next meal, the camera cut to a body paint smeared, Dixie cup crushing vision of No Holds Barred fueled insanity. An image that has lived in mimetic infamy for the last 17 years. UFC 15 was the origin story of the Just Bleed guy. In the heavyweight finals, it would be charitable to say that Kerr fought Dwayne Kaysen, when in reality, Kerr blast doubled, poured on ground and pound, and submitted Kaysen with a rear naked choke in only slightly more time than it took to film the Just Bleed guy flexing. UFC 15 was ground zero for early MMA memes, as the heavyweight super fight between Victor Belfort and Randy Couture was when we were introduced to the legend of no known weaknesses Victor. But unbeknownst to the guys in the UFC graphics department, Victor had one glaring weakness. Pre-fight, he had asked John McCarthy to come to his hotel room to explain what strikes were legal for Couture to throw when they were on the ground. McCarthy came away from the meeting feeling like Victor was nervous about the matchup, a feeling that was confirmed when he was a no-show on fight night and left Randy waiting in the octagon for 10 full minutes. Victor had locked himself in his bathroom and was complaining about stomach issues. McCarthy found him and gave him an ultimatum: either be in the octagon in 2 minutes or the match is forfeit. Victor made the walk, but the damage was done. Couture used his wrestling to control him for the majority of the first round, before TKOing him with punches and knees and handing the Brazilian his first loss. In the main event, Maurice Smith was supposed to face none other than Dan Severn for the heavyweight title fight, but Dan was busy doing an any % speedrun of every combat sports organization in existence. 2 weeks before UFC 15, he was in Japan fighting in the very first Pride FC event. Severn fought oversized novelty crucifix enthusiast Kimo Leopoldo, and after 30 minutes of fighting, the bout was ruled a draw. But Severn had injured his hand in the match and was unable to fight at UFC 15. The UFC substituted Severn with everyone's second favourite pit fighter, Tank Abbott. Everyone's favourite pit fighter obviously being Chainman Eddie. In an era where MMA still had one foot in the world of respectful martial arts tournaments, with fighters wearing gis and bowing before entering the octagon, Tank was an anomaly, as he was just a big fat drunk who knocked motherfuckers out. Like MMA's very own Stone Cold Steve Austin, Tank was a disrespectful, blue-collar anti-hero who seemed like he had just rolled into the octagon after a 3-day bender. And most of the time, he had. This image played well with audiences at the time. Tank was a self-insert for every beer-swilling slob that fancied themselves as a real ultimate badass. Tank was antithetical to what people thought of as a tough guy or martial artist in those days. We had been raised on action heroes who were either powerlifters like Schwarzenegger or martial artists who were ripped as shit and doing the splits like Jean-Claude Van Damme. Yet here was a man who looked like the last guy to leave the bar every night, beating the shit out of martial arts masters who trained in the ancient Hawaiian art of bone breaking. Tank's popularity in those days was such that he was chosen to represent the UFC in an episode of Friends. And I want you to really think about that for a second. UFC 15 was being held in a casino parking lot, it was banned from pay-per-view, and the organisation was slowly circling the drain. Yet when asked to send a representative of the sport to star in the world's biggest TV show, they just assumed Coleman was too busy training neck, and were worried Vitor's physique might be a bit too perfect, so instead, they sent Tank fucking Abbott to represent the UFC on the world stage. That's how popular he was with UFC fans in those days. But Tank's biggest weakness was his own ego. He just naturally assumed that brute strength and a few beers were all he needed to succeed, that swanging and banging would always be the best base for no-holds-barred fighting. And when you can bench press 600 pounds while wearing work boots, you can kinda see why one might fall into that line of thinking. But given enough time, all things succumb to entropy. By the time of UFC 15, Tank's pit fighting style was as stale and predictable as a YouTuber trying to stealth insert a NordVPN advert. Online security is important to me, and I'd prefer my ISP doesn't know that I downloaded 3 terabytes of Valentina Shevchenko photos from the dark web. So when I surf the web, I say, fuck NordVPN, and protect myself by pulling the curtains and placing a napkin over my head, that I may hide my face and deeds from God. Maurice Smith was a stylistic nightmare for Tank. A razor-sharp striker with good takedown defense was always going to win against a guy whose game plan involved copious amounts of windmilling. As with Coleman, Smith survived Tank's ground game, and once Tank had worn himself out, Smith blasted him with leg kicks, eventually forcing the beer-swilling badass to verbally submit. With the win over Tank, Smith became the first man to ever successfully defend the UFC heavyweight title. 1997 was a busy year for Smith. After winning the title in July and defending it in October, his second defense was set for the UFC's Japanese debut in December of '97. After years of fighting in civic centres and tents, the UFC was greeted in Japan by a capacity crowd at the Yokohama Arena. UFC Japan was notable for a number of reasons. Making his debut at UFC Japan was commentator Mike Goldberg, who did a fantastic job of explaining the internet to us.
We'd like to remind you that you can be part of the action by dialing us up on the internet, surfing to our website, www.ufclive.com. That's www.ufclive.com. You'll have the opportunity via your computer to witness everything that occurs inside the octagon live on the internet. You sit and watch and stand through the cities here in Japan and see how the technological advances are so great. It just is appropriate that we have now been able to break through on the internet.
In what was befitting for a country ravaged by near-daily Godzilla attacks, UFC Japan was a disastrous card that endured more pullouts than a Catholic wife. Originally set to be headlined by Ken Shamrock vs Nobuhiko Takada, the main event was scrapped when Shamrock refused to do a worked fight and Takada pulled out. Mark Kerr was also scheduled to fight, but he was pulled not only from the card, but the entire organisation. Kerr had taken the UFC's parent company SEG to court in order to secure a release from the UFC so he could fight for Pride. Japan has a long history of obsessing with muscle-bound freaks, so Kerr's withdrawal was a huge blow to the card. Victor Belfort was also scheduled to fight, but cast doubts on his own appearance when he claimed to still be suffering from the worm intestinal virus that had caused him to be fashionably late for his match with Couture. With Victor's potential withdrawal, the entire event was at the risk of being scrapped, so the UFC came to a compromise. Victor would fight, but he got to choose his own opponent. He chose Joe Charles, a man who was to MMA what generic brands were to supermarkets of the 1980s. Charles has a record of 6 wins, 13 losses, and has lost to every big-name fighter he ever fought. If this man isn't a tomato can, he is at the very least can-adjacent. As well as being Goldie's debut, it was also the last event involving UFC co-founder Art Davie. Davie had been plotting to break away and form his own hat-based MMA organisation called Thunderdome. He was convinced that the proliferation of wrestle-humping and the implementation of lame shit like rules would be the death knell for the UFC and wanted to create a true no-holds-barred event. When this treachery was uncovered, Davie was fired by Bob Meyerowitz before he could fly out for UFC Japan. This event was also the one and only time legendary fighter Kazushi Sakuraba would appear in the UFC. 3 years before his epic 90-minute match with Royce Gracie in Pride, Sakuraba and his teammate Yoji Anjo fought at UFC Japan, representing Takada's pro wrestling organization, Kingdom. If you haven't heard of Yoji Anjo before, that's not surprising, as he has an overall record of 0 wins and 5 losses in MMA, and may seem barely worthy of a footnote in the sport's history. But Anjo played a role far greater than his awful record might suggest, as he was almost single-handedly responsible for the creation of Pride FC. To give a very brief summation, Rickson Gracie was called out by Takada, but refused to fight as he viewed Takada as a fake fighter. Anjo dojo stormed Rickson Gracie's gym, demanding to fight for the honour of his mentor. Rickson gave Anjo an absolute hiding, and the fallout led to the inception of Pride, whose first event was created as a platform for Rickson and Takada to settle their beef. But getting back to the night of December 21st, 1997, Anjo was set to fight Tank Abbott. The fight was easy work for Tank, as Anjo had about as much real fighting experience as Ishida Kim, and Tank cruised to victory after ground and pounding Anjo against the fence for 15 minutes. In his one and only UFC fight, Sakuraba fought Conan Silveira, the man that Maurice Smith had beaten to become the Battlecade champion in '96. But their fight ended controversially after Sakuraba shot for a low single that was mistaken for a knockdown by Big John McCarthy. The fight was waved off, but Sakuraba staged a sit-in protest in the octagon for 45 minutes. The protest worked, and the match was rebooked for later that evening. For Silveira, however, the moment had passed. He had been hounded by the press post-fight and told that if he didn't take the immediate rematch, he'd be responsible for the death of the UFC. The pressure Silveira felt affected his performance and led to a relatively easy armbar win for Sakuraba.
You win!
I never had such an easy victory.
In the main event, Smith was set to defend the heavyweight title against Randy Couture. Couture was 3-0 in the UFC, with his most noteworthy win being over Victor Belfort at UFC 15. An Olympic alternate, NCAA Division I wrestler, and sergeant in the 101st Airborne, Couture was the epitome of all-American badassery, like Tank Abbott but without the functional alcoholism. After tasting a few of Smith's leg kicks, Couture decided, fuck that, and successfully took him down. And for the next 21 minutes, that's exactly where the fight stayed. I wouldn't advise anyone to actually watch this fight. While it is important from a historical standpoint, from an entertainment standpoint, it's MMA's very own Gringo Pappy. After 21 minutes of laying on Smith like the embodiment of sleep paralysis, the judges gave the decision to Randy. For the third time in heavyweight history, a new champion was crowned. If the climactic battle between Smith and Couture felt decidedly anticlimactic, that's because it was. UFC Japan was a terrible card, topped off with a terrible main event. Almost every fight had been a lay-and-pray hump carnival, the same length as an episode of The Big Bang Theory, and somehow less enjoyable. After 4 years of wrestling domination, Smith's win over Coleman had seemed like a transition of power from grapplers to strikers, yet that December night in 1997 was a return to the status quo. This was the future Art Davie was trying to warn us about when he envisioned Thunderdome. Randy would go on to have one of the most storied careers in MMA, but his performance at UFC Japan was an inauspicious way to claim the title, and a deeply troubling portent for enjoyers of pugilistic-based hyperviolence.
Already I see some battle wounds and some bruises.
No, Randy. There were no battle wounds, there were no bruises. It was not great. After losing the heavyweight title, Smith copied Dan Severn's homework and kept on fighting as if he could only retire once the PlayStation 4 was released. He fought for so many different organizations, both in kickboxing and MMA, that it seemed like he was collecting them like Pokemon. He fought in K1 until 2005, and while his win-loss record post-2000 suffered a noticeable decline, there was no shame in losing to kickboxing royalty like Andy Hug and Peter Aerts. He fought for the UFC 4 more times, at UFC 19, 21, 27 and 28. But like Coleman before him, once the heavyweight title was lost, it was lost forever. Outside of the UFC, he fought in organizations like Rings, Pride, RFA, and the incredibly titled WFA 7, Stomp in the Swamp. Smith even coached the Seattle Tiger Sharks in the ill-fated team-based MMA promotion IFL. In 2012, Smith seemed to have pulled off a Dan Severn-esque fairy tale ending for his career, when after 4 years of inactivity and at the age of 50, he came out of semi-retirement and fought a far younger man named George Cordoba. Smith looked like he hadn't lost a step in the intervening years. His kicks and punches still had speed, and he appeared to be in almost identical shape to his early UFC days. In the third round, he placed a capstone on his career with a picture-perfect head kick knockout, all of which would have been a fantastic way to end a career, but unfortunately for Smith, he decided to have one last fight in 2013, which he lost by decision. An outcome that really only serves to further hammer home just how rare an ending like Dan Severn's is in a sport that routinely treats its participants as so much wheat before the scythe. Smith was inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame in 2017, and after that, he departs this story for good. There's very little to be found about him online. His social media account stopped posting in 2013, and thankfully, there are no depressing videos of him being arrested or tales of addiction and bankruptcy. stories that seem to be the stock in trade for a depressingly large portion of retired fighters. And while I did reach out to him to see if he'd like to talk for this video, unfortunately, Maurice Smith was too busy tracking down a cocaine smuggling ninja biker gang. As the sun was setting on the 1990s, so too was it setting on the UFC's hold on the lineal title. From its inception at UFC 12, the title had remained within the UFC, but newly crowned heavyweight champion Randy Couture had other notions. He had won the belt on Japanese soil, underneath the cold and indifferent gaze of Mount Fuji. But contract disputes with the UFC meant that for the foreseeable future, Randy and the lineal title would remain in Japan. UFC had ruled the 90s, but the 2000s, they would belong to Pride.
This is one shameful fucking performance.